Tonight on The Story. You know what? Actually, real quick, just before we get started, I have to remind everybody, just want you to know, today is the deadline to register to vote in Oregon. If you don't do it by today, you can't. Just so you know. Okay, moving on. Tonight on The Story, why Oregon might want to pay close attention to planned attacks on 2 American governors. Plus, I'd be remiss if I didn't really, I want this to be crystal. If you don't register before midnight tonight, you can't vote. I mean, in the presidential election, which, I mean, this is a big one, all right? I know I'm beating the drum. I'll stop. I'm done. Seriously. And finally, some relief on the horizon for Portland's homeless. Here's the seriously last time. I know it's annoying at this point. I get that. But just register, okay? There are people who have to live with me, honestly. Welcome to The Story. I'm Dan Haggerty. Don't forget to use that hashtag HeyDan to talk to us tonight. I am persistent. It's actually one of my better qualities, I tell myself in the mirror. But you're really going to want to vote. You know what I'm saying? Like, you don't want to let this pass you by and then you look back and go, what was I thinking? You have to until 11:59 and 59 seconds tonight to register in Oregon. If you have an Oregon driver's license or an ID, I mean, it couldn't be easier. You can do the whole thing online. If you don't, if you have an out-of-state license, you need to print this form from the website. You deliver a signed copy in person to the county elections office. And the Multnomah County office closes at 7 o'clock, okay? So, my boss doesn't like when I tell people to like go do stuff during the show, but if I'm talking to you, go do stuff during the show, okay? Hit record on the DVR, subscribe on YouTube or something. We will be here when you get back, I promise. For everyone else, let's get to the big story. Now, the beauty of living in the United States, one of the beauties of living in this country, is if you don't like the way things are going, you can generally just vote the people out who are in charge, right? Making those decisions every couple of years, you get somebody else in there to do something different. But we've learned that over the last few weeks, if you got some guns, a private Facebook group, and the willingness to do a little harm, you can just try and take matters into your own hands.
Federal and state authorities have arrested more than a dozen men accused of plotting to kidnap the governor of Michigan, allegedly planned to snatch Governor Gretchen Whitmer from her vacation home.
Now, just today, the FBI announcing that the same group, these people here, also discussed grabbing Virginia's governor, Ralph Northam. But I want to focus on Governor Whitmer from Michigan for just a second, because ever since she mandated strict COVID-19 closures in her state, she has been the focus of some seriously hateful comments. I mean, just search for a few minutes online. You'll find stuff like this, calling her public enemy number 1, or saying she needs to be charged with treason. Lock this woman away. And now's the part where I tell you that these comments are actually about our governor. The same kind of hateful internet chatter directed at Michigan's governor mirror the tweets and Facebook posts aimed at Oregon Governor Kate Brown. And I'm betting that really doesn't surprise you all that much. After all, the two have a lot in common. I mean, they're both Democrats. They took aggressive stances to prevent COVID-19 from spreading, which led to some people losing their businesses. They're both women. I mean, all things people have honed in on in their various attacks. I mean, if you look at some of the things that people are writing about Governor Brown and Michigan Governor Whitmer, you start to see a lot of patterns: vicious, hateful, oftentimes sexist, and in some cases violent patterns. And now that we have seen what a small group of people are capable of planning, is it really that hard to believe that something like that could potentially happen in Oregon? I mean, look, last year during that big cap and trade fiasco, the Oregon Capitol shut down after leaders received warnings of a possible threat from similar right-wing groups. We've seen this type of ideological politics turn violent many times in our area. How about this over the summer when the right-wing Proud Boys attacked and fought protesters on the steps of the Capitol building? So these discussions about our governor may be hypothetical, but they're certainly not fantasy. And in Michigan and Virginia, they're not either of those things. And it's only thanks to the FBI stopping it that there weren't 2 American governors being held in some, I don't know, kind of kangaroo court at gunpoint or whatever it is they have planned. I don't know. Look, I know everybody posting on Facebook isn't going to go out and kidnap a governor. But at what point does a comment become a red flag? I asked a guy who studies extremism, PSU professor Randy Blazak. The things people are discussing, saying, sharing openly have become so extreme given the nature of what this country is going through, the things people are talking about, the rhetoric that's being used all the way from the presidential debates down to the kitchen table. These red flags, I kind of see them every single day based on things that show up in my comment section. How are you to decipher what is a threat and what is just somebody
talking and saying something mean or rude.
Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done there. There's a lot of work to be done from law enforcement. They are going to be working overtime for the next 100 days. And there's a lot of vigilance from the community. And you sort of know in retrospect, but one of the things I always point out is that Jeremy Christian, who was the Max Train stabber in 2017, on his Facebook page had a kind of tribute poem to Timothy McVeigh with a picture of the Oklahoma City bombing building, the federal building, and that he wanted to carry in his footsteps. So that was a red flag right there. And so when we can start having community groups who can monitor extremism, working with law enforcement to kind of break up some of these threats. But, you know, it's a challenge. It's a challenge. I mean, Timothy McVeigh was a conspiracy of sort of 2 or 3 people that took out 168 people, including 19 children who were in a daycare facility. They are ready to do that. They have justified, in their minds, massive casualties to save America from what they think of as America's enemy.
You know, when you put it that way, man. And I'll tell you, these fears, and you know, maybe fears, maybe that's too heavy of a word. These concerns, they don't live in a vacuum. On the screen right now, we have this email that Jim from Portland wrote in just a few days ago. Says this: with the possibility of civil unrest after the U.S. election, what are the known militias in Oregon, and what threat do they pose, if any? Now, Blazak says that a lot of groups, you know, like the Proud Boys or Patriot Prayer or the 3%ers, on the surface, they come across as just free speech and Second Amendment advocates. But it's underneath that they are deeply rooted in anti-Semitism and sexism, and many are actively arming themselves and preparing for a second American Civil War. Blazak even says some of them think that war is only weeks away.
Should I be concerned as an average citizen about what's going to happen following this election?
I think there's real reason for concern. There's real reason for concern for people who work for the federal government, for example. They live with the specter of Timothy McVeigh all the time, and I think that's amplified now. People that live in places that are seen as signs of the change, which are Portland. Portland has become a symbol of what threat looms for the rest of the country. You know, there's a rhetoric that says, don't let your city or don't let your county or state become Portland, Oregon, because that's a socialist communist nightmare with anarchists running through the streets, smashing windows. And so that threat has been used to mobilize these folks for their armed confrontation.
Well, okay. So I guess we go ahead and bump armed extremists and potential civil war into 2020's growing list of thoughts to have while sleeplessly staring at your ceiling. You almost kind of forget, in a way, all the problems that we had before this year, like homelessness, which is still a problem now, but had topped the list hands down for years and years and years before 2020. And as we get closer to Election Day, its importance is being discussed more and more. And something Portland's mayor said that caught our attention at a press conference yesterday, which was largely about the weekend's protests. Our team also asked Mayor Ted Wheeler about the latest on his threat to pull the city out of the joint offices of homeless services. It's basically this partnership between the city of Portland and Multnomah County. They both funnel money into it so that they can work together to fix the housing crisis and all the problems that arise from it. The mayor's threat a couple of weeks ago, though, was a really big deal. It hinged on his demand that the office find hundreds of new shelter beds by November, basically by Election Day. Coincidence? Who's to say? Anyway, here's part of his answer yesterday.
We need to act with urgency. We need to act as though this is an emergency, not just an ongoing management of the homeless situation scenario. And so I've called for 300 shelter beds over the course of the last couple of weeks. We opened the first 170 of those shelter beds at the Charles Jordan Center and the Mount Scott Community Centers, working with partners, including the Joint Office of Homeless Services and other community providers. And we now have the last 130 beds identified, and we'll be making an announcement about that shortly.
So it sounds like the Portland area is indeed getting hundreds more beds. We asked his office for some details about that, but they said the deal was not quite ready to be announced yet, so we're going to have to keep you posted on what they tell us. In the meantime, a lot of you have been writing in about changes that you are seeing in your communities on your streets, and we noticed a little bit of a pattern about one change in particular. This, I think, is a perfect example. Jim Gibson wrote in and asked, what's the story behind the red portable toilets that are showing up around Portland? Jim, great question. Thank you for sending it along. And you are by far not the only one wondering about it. In fact, Maggie Vespa met up with another viewer who asked us the exact same thing.
Amid a global pandemic, with so many public spaces closed, families have few escapes. Bree Areolas makes a point of exploring their Southeast Portland neighborhood.
My son and I, our daily routine is to take a walk around the neighborhood.
And recently, she spotted something new.
And I noticed that the porta potty was placed there.
The red porta potty was a surprise to Areola and her neighbors. None of them knew where it came from. Granted, there are clues.
It had graffiti all over it, specifically saying Mayor Wheeler, no toilets in front of people's homes, which got me thinking that this was not a construction toilet.
No, it's not. But Areola can take heart. She's not the only one confused. Multiple viewers have written into us asking, what's the deal? All right, let's cut to the chase. You might have guessed the city of Portland is indeed behind this. In fact, staff confirmed they've placed more than 100 of these porta potties across the city in the last month. 103 to be exact, plus 22 individual hand washing stations. The city is leasing them for $100 a month each. Right now, a rep for the city says they're cleaning them as needed, but they're training more staff who can eventually clean them 6 times per week. The reason why? Again, the pandemic has closed a lot of public spaces, and people living on the streets are having a hard time finding restrooms. It's why you'll see a lot of these near camps. But that brings us back to Areola, who points out in her neighborhood, there are no camps in sight.
I believe that every single human being has a right to clean water, has a right to a safe place to use the bathroom, and has right to basic hygiene. I believe everybody has that. But what I don't understand is who this toilet is being put here to service.
That's where the city says their algorithm gets more complicated. They're also placing these in areas where camps or no camps, public restrooms are scarce. Restroom deserts, if you will. Their rationale? Amid the pandemic, proper hygiene is pivotal, as is access to restrooms. They've even set up this live interactive map to help people find and use these porta potties 24/7. Makes sense on the surface, says Areola, but she still finds this one at Southeast 53rd and Pardee confusing.
What it's about is putting the resources where they are most needed. Putting them in the large encampments, putting them over by Woodstock Park.
In fact, her neighbors told us the people using this one most are delivery drivers. Maggie Vespa, KGW News.
Have we mentioned that today is the deadline to register to vote in Oregon? We have, like 1,000 times? Oh, okay. Well, still, we're going to take a look at how many people have already registered in Oregon. Plus, why the race to be Washington's governor can kind of feel like the race to be lieutenant governor. We'll explain when the story continues.
And welcome back to the story. Keep those comments and questions coming to any of the places you see on your screen, email, Twitter, Facebook, all that kind of stuff. And you know what? I can't believe I almost forgot. I forgot to say something earlier in the show. I don't know if you know this, but today is the deadline to register to vote in Oregon. You have until midnight to do it online if you have an Oregon ID. If you don't have an Oregon ID, you're going to have to basically go down to your local county elections office before it closes. So I won't be offended if you have to leave. All right, hit pause. Go. Take care of it. Man, I feel better. I can't believe I almost forgot to mention that. And it's going to be a big one. I mean, right? I don't even need to tell you that. I can feel it. You can feel it. I mean, just look at these numbers from the Secretary of State's office. As of last month, there are nearly 3 million registered voters across Oregon. If you compare that to September of the last presidential election cycle in 2016, there were only 2.5 million registered voters. Then this time in 2012, 2.1 million. Now, because of things like Oregon's motor voter law, these numbers are only going to get bigger and bigger as we continue to grow and the state gets bigger with its population. And when it comes to voting, Oregon knows what it's doing. We pretty much wrote the book on mail-in, or at least wrote the law on it.
Oregon has some of the highest voter turnout in the country, and our mail-in voting system is a big reason why. So, how did we get here? Well, let's go back to 1981. That's when Oregon first tested mail-in voting in local elections. By the end of the decade, the popularity spread, and most counties were voting by mail. But some elections, they still made you go to the polls the old-fashioned way, and having two different voting systems, well, kind of confused people a bit. So in 1998, Oregon overwhelmingly passed our mail-in voting measure that required vote by mail in every election. And at the time, we were the only state to do it. Now, Oregon, as we mentioned, regularly has some of the highest voter turnout in the country, partly due to mail-in, but also thanks to the fact that every time somebody gets or renews their license here in Oregon, they're automatically registered to vote. And that's how we got here.
Oh, we are seeing that number of registered voters go up and up, or as my producer wrote in that full screen graphic just before, registrated voters, which we love making up a good word here on the story. Now, while Oregon might have been, sorry, Brian, for calling you out, might have been the mail-in voting trailblazer, other states have kind of caught up over time and made it easier to register to vote there. I mean, I don't know if I mentioned that today is the deadline. Did I? Forget about it. But in Washington, you can register right up into Election Day. So why can't you do that in Oregon? Well, according to this unreadable wall of text on the state of Oregon's website, Oregon law dictates that the deadline is always 21 days before Election Day. However, depending on which of these women become Oregon's next Secretary of State after the November election, that voter registration deadline may potentially change. Democrat Shamia Fagan says that she supports same-day voter registration like Washington, while Republican Kim Thatcher does not, even says the idea makes her uncomfortable. All right. I'm just going to come right out and say it. We probably don't spend enough time reporting on Southwest Washington, but we should, all right? Because a lot of you who watch us live there and you write in and tell us about it all the time. So we want to do better, starting tonight by talking about the Washington governor's race. Let's take a look at it. Governor Jay Inslee is running for his third term against Republican Loren Culp. Now, Inslee is way up in the polls by 14 points, but Culp's showing his support has been growing rather since he was chosen in the primary. I talked to Chris Daniels from our sister station in Seattle. He hosted a debate between these two last week. The first thing I wanted to know is, who exactly is this guy running what seems to be this long shot campaign against Inslee?
Loren Culp is an interesting story. A small town police chief who is his only employee in the police department in Republic, Washington, who has really become a celebrity in conservative circles because of his stand on I-1639, and that has propelled him to this statewide race against a sitting governor who is seeking his third term. I think if you just look at it objectively, a small town police chief versus a longtime politician, it's an interesting race. We'll see, though, if Loren Culp can close it here in the weeks to come. When you look at the big issue right now for voters, it's COVID, it's the economy, and when you tie that into his belief, his policy that it's an individual choice whether or not to wear a mask, it kind of enhances all those issues. And we have seen Loren Culp have multiple rallies where people are not wearing masks, and that's been easy material for the Inslee camp to say, hey, look, he's not following the laws of the land. He's a law and order candidate, but doesn't want to just put on a mask. And it's really added a different element to this race between two candidates who are definitely different.
Now, he mentioned that Culp's known for taking that stand on I-1639, Initiative 1639. That was the gun control law the voters passed in 2018 that raised the legal age to buy semi-automatic weapons and added more background checks and safe storage requirements. Culp declared that he wouldn't enforce it as a police chief of Republic, way up in northeast Washington. That town is, by the way, pretty small. It only has about 1,000 people in it. You heard him mention he's the only employee in the police department. Let's talk about Inslee now for a moment. His name has never been more recognizable, especially nationally. He ran for president last year. I'm not sure how many of you remember that, trying to get on the Democratic ticket as the nominee, but dropped out pretty early. But he did get noticed because he decided to focus his entire campaign on climate change. Then earlier this year, Washington did have the first COVID outbreak in the country, and Inslee was front and center as the pandemic response began. So taking all that into account, I asked Chris if he thinks Inslee wants to continue being governor. I know he's running for it, but does he want to continue in that spot, or is he looking at something bigger?
It's a great question, and it's actually colored the lieutenant governor's race as well, with people looking at that race as potentially somebody who would step into the governor's mansion if Jay Inslee was to accept a job in a potential Biden administration. There's been a lot of talk and a lot of scuttlebutt in political circles that Inslee is eyeing perhaps a position like the Secretary of the Interior or the head of the EPA. He has denied that through this campaign cycle, says that he intends to fulfill his 4 years.
Now, we also talked about the big issues for Washington voters, and no surprise, the pandemic, the economy, racial justice, pretty similar to a lot of places in the country right now. But polling from back in January and February showed people in Washington really care about homelessness and transportation as well, and those issues do still exist, even during this insanity of 2020. All right, I hope you've been sending in some feedback because we're going to read a few right here on live TV after the break. Think I'm joking? Call my bluff? Send me an email. I'll read it. I will. I'll see you when we finish the story. Next. Oh, man. Ken Ross writing in, hey, Dan, you should remind people to register to vote. Today's the deadline. I forgot about that. Thanks, Ken. Hey, and then Greg N writing in and saying, you missed it. Why does Oregon not have the same day registration? Because when we did, the Rajneeshis, they took over a city with fake residents. And then PDX or Bus said kind of something similar. For history, can't register to vote closer to Election Day. Look at the Rajneeshis in Wasco County in the election in 1984. So we're planning on doing more on that. We'll get all the details, but you're onto something. And then I want to read something from Sonia here. She said, Dan, you focus on and spew a story about the kidnap plans of the right-wing militia group and the Michigan governor, but leave out, close your eyes, and disregard the far-left, unhinged radicals tearing down our statues, monuments, and destroying the city of Portland. You wimp. I am not a wimp, first of all. Secondly, some might consider me a wimp. We've covered that. We have the show's on 5 nights a week. We cover all that stuff. And also, it's not like a competition. If I do a story on car crashes, I don't get a call from people saying, yeah, but what about breaking and entering? Like, we're talking about one topic, and we will and have covered the other topic. So, nothing wimpy about that at all, if you ask me. That's the story. Thanks for being with us. I'll see you tomorrow.